Socrates, the man who was unwavering in his principles. Socrates was born in 469 BC to his sculptor father and his midwife mother. They lived in a small village about a 20-minute walk from Athens, and when Socrates was a boy, he studied music, gymnastics, and grammar, which were very, very common for the youth of his time to study. Then a little bit later on in life, he followed his father into the profession of being a sculptor, and he was actually his apprentice for a little while. And apparently he was an exceptional artist, and his statue of the Graces on the road of Acropolis is said to have been admired in the 2nd century CE, which this is something I definitely did not know about him. I did not know that he was a fantastic artist. Now, one of Socrates' first teachers, his very first teacher was Anaxagoras, but not too long after he was his teacher, Anaxagoras was charged with impiety because he said the sun was a red-hot glowing stone and the moon was actually made from earth, which are some pretty crazy things to say at the time, especially since it's pretty much true. But because of this, because of his charges, he was forced to flee Athens, and then Socrates got a new teacher. And this new teacher was Archelaus. Archelaus was one of those teachers that liked his students a little too much, and he would often try to have intercourse with his own students. He specifically became very attracted to Socrates and tried to sleep with him multiple times. And of course, at this time within Greece and this time in the world, it was much more common for men to be with other men and women to be with other women. It wasn't even seen as a rebellious thing, it was just a very normal thing at the time. But after this time, Socrates started to think a lot more. He started to begin his journey of becoming the Socrates we know today. And he eventually repeated the saying, "Know thyself," which actually did not come from him, but it's popular mainly because of him and because of Plato. Because Plato is the only reason we really know about Socrates. He was one of the two people that actually documented the life of Socrates and the events in Socrates' life. Socrates was the type of guy that you would not want to have a debate with, or even just like a basic philosophical discussion with, because not only was he very intelligent, but he was always trying to poke holes in your argument and find out where you were wrong and exactly how you were wrong. He was just a very fierce opponent to deal with. And at this time, he also didn't have a job. He wasn't working or anything. He never wanted to work. He wanted to live the life of a philosopher at the time. This involved him having tons and tons of time all day to think and to have conversations or debates with other people. So word spread fast about Socrates throughout Athens, and very quickly, everyone knew who he was. Now, by the time he was 30, his friend Seraphon asked the oracle at Delphi if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, and the oracle answered, "None. There is no one wiser than Socrates." And Socrates thought this was insane. How could he be the wisest man? After all, he said, "I know nothing except the fact of my own ignorance." So Socrates decided, well, I have to prove the oracle wrong. Even though I believe that the oracle speaks to the gods, I also cannot believe this because I believe I know nothing. So he goes around speaking to the other wise men of Athens, and then he realizes that they're actually not as wise as he. Now, why is the reason for this? It's because he said he knew his own ignorance. And during this time when he was trying to find the wisest men, he would again engage in philosophical debates to better understand their ideas and better understand his own ideas. And oftentimes he would turn his opponents, these wise men, into laughingstocks. And by doing this, he definitely gained many, many enemies. He found, to his dismay, quote, that the men whose reputation for wisdom stood highest were nearly the most lacking in it, while others who were looked down as a common people were much more intelligent. So like I said, the only reason Socrates came to the conclusion that the oracle at Delphi was correct in saying that there was no one wiser than him was because he recognized his own ignorance. Now the youth in Athens started to recognize Socrates more and more and follow him more and more, because they would watch him have these debates with the elders who were just working at a small little merchant shop, and how it would turn into this big debate. and they thought it was very interesting, so they started to follow Socrates. And many of these young men would discard all of their other aspirations to become a philosopher and follow Socrates. And if you don't know what the word philosophy actually technically means, it means the love of wisdom. Among some of these young men were Antisthenes, who was the founder of the Cynic school, Aristippus, who was the founder of the Cyrenaic school, Xenophon, whose writings would influence the Zeno of Cithium, who was the founder of the Stoic school, and most famously Plato, who was the main source of all information we have on Socrates, among many, many other young men. Every major philosophical school mentioned during this time were all created by followers of Socrates. Now, a very interesting time came when the Peloponnesian War started, and Socrates was still middle-aged at this point, and he was actually a very good fighter. And it's hard to believe because he was known as the ugliest man in Athens. He had these weird bowed legs, and he looks like he would not be the type of man to fight, but he could. He was hairy, he was bald, had bowed legs, had a bulging nose, bulging eyes, big lips. He just looked like a freak. And he also dressed like a philosopher. He wore his tunic all year round and never any shoes. Now, by the time it was winter and the winter air was blowing down from Bulgaria, he was still walking around in his tunic and no shoes. And that's just insane because he would be seen walking through feet of snow in the cold air, being completely fine by his fellow soldiers. And even though he was so opinionated and also ugly, he was also such an oddball that it was actually hard to dislike him. He was just an interesting character. Now, there was one time in particular that Alcibiades talks about where Socrates just sat still in one spot, just thinking, like the thinking man statue, in the same spot for an entire day and throughout the night, just sitting there thinking. And the soldiers would watch him sitting there, watching him, because how could he just sit there and think throughout the night completely fine? They ended up sleeping outside of their own tents to watch him sit there and think all night. And then when the morning came, he said a prayer, he got up and walked away like nothing happened. Now, it was said that Socrates would hear voices in his head and often get lost in thought and just be completely lost to the world. And this is also very interesting. I think a lot of wise people like Socrates tend to have a lot going on in their head and tend to hear like other personalities or other people in their head. And I think that's how they get into such deep conversations with themselves. Now, during one of the battles, Alcibiades, who was a Athenian general, was saved by Socrates. Alcibiades was lying out in the middle of a field while there were enemies everywhere, and then Socrates comes out of nowhere, charging in, picks him up, puts Alcibiades over his shoulder, and runs out in the path of enemy soldiers and saves Alcibiades' life. Now, here's a little weird part. After doing such a good deed as saving Alcibiades, Alcibiades then fell in love with Socrates. There was a decent age gap at this point, and also Alcibiades was a young man. Now, it is said that Alcibiades did have poor eyesight, and this might have literally distorted his view of Socrates, but it's only mentioned in some of Plato's writings, but we can't know for sure. And at this point, Alcibiades decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to seduce Socrates. And that's exactly what he did. He'd invited Socrates over to his house to spend the whole day with him to hopefully get to the topic of intercourse eventually, but it didn't happen. Socrates just sat there talking about philosophy the entire time. Then Alcibiades thought, what's the next best thing? Well, we go to the gym and we work out naked in the gym most of the time at this point in Athens. So I'll invite Socrates to the gym with me so we can work out naked. And that's what he did. And at that same time, they also had a wrestling match, also naked. And during this time, Alcibiades was hoping something would happen. Nothing did. Now, I think it's very likely that Alcibiades probably did have poor eyesight, because to see Socrates naked, this very ugly, hairy guy who's bald, who has bulging eyes, a big nose, and is just not nice to look at, he still was attracted to him. And I think he had poor eyesight. I mean, I think there's no way. Then finally, Alcibiades decided, you know what? I'm going to invite Socrates to dinner, and I'm going to try to get him as drunk as I can. Socrates gets there, and he spends the whole night talking, mainly about philosophy, and he can outdrink Alcibiades. He could outdrink anyone. And then Socrates ended up staying so late that it only made sense for him to stay at Alcibiades' house. And he did, and so he laid down on the couch, and then Alcibiades thought, well, this might be my chance. So he snuck up behind Socrates and put his arms around him. But still, Socrates would not do anything. And now, while this does seem very strange to us today, this is actually would be like a superhuman feat for a man not to give in to another young man at this time in history. And even though it sounds weird to say refusing intercourse with another man is manly, it was, and especially at this time, it absolutely was. Now, as I said, Socrates was constantly broke. Constantly. Never wanted to get a job. He thought his God-given task was to show the people of Athens their own ignorance. But Socrates could still live decently well because he had very influential friends who would invite him over all the time because he was such a wonderful guest to have who could spend the whole night, was happy to spend the whole night talking, drinking, and he would outdrink everybody and just be this very fun person to have around. One great thing that Socrates did at this time, too, was hold conversation classes for the youth of Athens in this very, very small room. The place that Socrates would stand would only be about 4 paces by 4 paces. So it's tiny, but he would still take the time to teach the youth. I also just want to say, if I get any of these words or names incorrect, then I don't know what to do. They're very different names than we have today. Now, at the age of 50, Socrates married Xanthippe. It was said that Xanthippe was the only person who could out-debate Socrates. And I think the real reason for this is not necessarily that she was more wise. I think it was more of like a, yes, dear, you're right situation. But you never know. They ended up having 3 children who did not follow in their father's footsteps at all and just lived a very normal life. Now, the one great thing about Xanthippe was that she always stood by Socrates, even when he needed it most. Then at the age of 65, the Peloponnesian War finally ended in humiliation for Athens, and the Spartan leader Lysander sailed over to Athens to put in a different government. This government would be sympathetic to Sparta, and it was known as the 30 Tyrants. The tyrants absolutely terrorized Athens, arresting anyone who was clearly against Sparta. And many, many people fled. Many people who were like Socrates fled Athens, but Socrates stayed. One of the leaders of the 30 tyrants, known as Prietus, then issued an edict banning the teaching of philosophy, and he specifically mentioned Socrates in that edict. And this is the point where it became part of like politics too, and Socrates said, I don't want to be part of politics. I just want to be a man of principle. Then one day, Socrates and 4 other men were sent to an island to arrest a man known as Leon, who was a member of the democratic opposition. Socrates just ignored his orders and went home. Now, thankfully, Critias, who was the man who sent Socrates and the 4 men to arrest Leon, was killed, and the 30 tyrants were all deposed. But they were all replaced by Democrats who also did not like Socrates at all. And Socrates was safe up until 399 BC when he was arrested for impiety and corrupting the youth. Anytus was the main man behind these charges, and he did not like Socrates at all because Socrates inadvertently convinced his son to not continue the family tradition of tanning and to become a philosopher. Now, this whole trial was BS. I mean, Socrates was 70 by now, and he was facing the death penalty for impiety and corrupting the youth. Socrates was on trial in front of 500 members of the ruling council, and he took none of this seriously. He treated the trial like one of his philosophical conversations with himself. But the council did not find this funny, and they ended up ruling 280 to 220 in favor of the death penalty for Socrates. And after this, Socrates was supposed to argue why he should have a lesser sentence, but he then said that he should only have to pay 1 mina, which would be equivalent to 1 pitcher of wine, and that this would be his fine instead of having a death penalty. He also said that instead of being given the death penalty, he should be honored for what he's done, and he should be given a place at the, and I might say this wrong, Praetorium, which is the sacred hall where the heroes of Athens would get to live for free at the people's expense. And everyone was furious at Socrates for suggesting such a thing. Then Socrates said, "You know what? Instead of 1 mina for 1 pitcher of wine, I'll give you 30. That sounds like a good number." And then people just went insane and voted 360 to 140 in favor of giving him the death penalty. So Socrates was brought to his cell, and his friend Crito was there. And Crito tried to convince Socrates to just say, "Socrates, we can get you out, we can bribe the guards, and we can flee. We can get somewhere safe." But Socrates wouldn't do it. He said it was against everything he stood for, and that he believed in the rule of law, even if it was bad. While in his cell, Socrates sent his wife, Xantippe, away, because he didn't want people to be overly emotional during this time where he was going to die. Socrates then drank the hemlock poison, and his friend started crying. And he got mad at this. Like, while his body is numbing and he's dying, he gets mad at his friends for crying, saying, "This is why I sent my wife out. Why are you guys crying? Stop." And I think that's hilarious that he did that. But then Socrates laid down and died. Now, why is Socrates a great man? I think there's 2 big things that make him a great man. First of all, the fact that he was true to his principles and he was unwavering. The fact that he was unwavering absolutely makes him a great man. Every great man is unwavering in his principles, in his morals, his beliefs. Always, 100% of the time. The second thing was, he was a leader. Now, he was not like Alcibiades. He was not a general directing soldiers, but he was a leader by showing the youth of Athens a different way of life. That instead of spending so much time questioning the world, you should first question yourself and know thyself. And because of this, all of the major parts of philosophy come from him, at least in some way. Of course, you have Plato, who documented all of this, and who knows, maybe this whole thing could be made up by Plato. Maybe Socrates' whole life could be made up by Plato. Socrates was clearly a leader. He was indirectly leading the youth of Athens to just think a little more. And I think that's one thing great men do. They make you think just a little bit more. Could be about anything, but they make you think. Anyway, guys, this is the longest video I've done, so I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I hope you guys have learned a lot about Socrates and maybe have laughed a couple times. At least I hope you did. And also have learned how Socrates is a great man and how you have to get to the point where you never waver with your principles, no matter what situations you may face in life, no matter what decisions you have to make, how tough they are or how easy they are, but you have to be unwavering. You have to have strength. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.